Peter, I want to get your take on the Susie Wiles pick. The thinking, of course, among Trump allies is that Wiles ran a more disciplined campaign and that she will help run a more disciplined Trump White House. But this more disciplined campaign still gave us Trump lying about Haitian migrants, buddying up to Laura Loomer, the Arlington National Cemetery incident, calling opponents the enemy within, a Trump rally speaker making a racist joke about Puerto Rico, violent rhetoric about Democratic women, the media, and so forth. So how do you see the Wiles pick, and how does she compare, I guess, to the 4 chiefs of staff Trump went through in his first administration?
Yeah, I think obviously the word disciplined has a certain relative meaning when it comes to Trump and his campaigns and White House. It was more disciplined than some of his previous campaigns and efforts. But you're right to say that it was hardly, the model of modern discipline. And that's not possible. That's just not who Donald Trump is. And she recognizes that. I think Susie Wiles understands Trump, tries to figure out the best ways to channel his skills to the extent that he has them obviously on the campaign trail without getting in his way so that he would find her an impediment. It's very rare for somebody to last too long in the top position in Trump's orbit. We'll see how long she does, but she has the advantage of coming in, unlike her predecessor in terms of previous chief of staff, as somebody who was central to his campaign. Remember, Trump's first chief of staff last time around was Reince Priebus, who was the RNC chairman, who didn't particularly like Trump. It wasn't particularly an ally of Trump. In fact, he even suggested Trump drop out of the race in October of 2016 because of the Access Hollywood tape, or at least that he think about dropping out. That never went over well with Trump. So they never had a really close relationship. Susie Wiles has an advantage in that sense. As my colleague Maggie Haberman wrote this morning, and Jonathan Swan wrote this morning, I think, said she has the rare gift of being somebody who has tight ties with MAGA world, including Trump's family, his sons, but also with establishment Republicans who I think took a little bit of relief at the idea that she would be in charge in the West Wing.
We are reporting that Don Jr. is acting as a gatekeeper on candidates to fill key roles with veto power on potential contenders. He was instrumental in the J.D. Vance pick. Here he was on Fox yesterday discussing this process.
I'm going to be heavily involved on the transition. I want to make sure now that we know who the real players are, the people who will actually deliver on the president's message, the people who don't think that they know better than the duly elected president of the United States. I want to make sure that those people are in his cabinet. I want to make sure that those people are in this administration.
Brendan, the first time around, of course, we had Ivanka, you had Jared Kushner, who had pull in the White House. Now, Don Jr., what does that signal to you?
Well, I think it's a marked difference from 8 years ago, where Donald Trump came in and he sort of knew he didn't know how any of this worked. And he would defer to a lot of people like Reince Priebus and help me figure this out. He made a lot of conventional picks for a lot of his cabinet, some unconventional, but a lot of people he was basically asking, who do you think I should pick? And he went through sort of normal Washington names and picked his cabinet. I think what Don Jr. there is getting at is really important. This time, he's not going to be looking for advice from a lot of outside people. He definitely thinks he knows better. When I was there in 2017, he deferred on the legislative agenda a lot to my old boss, Paul Ryan, and said, you and Mitch McConnell figure that out. I trust you. I'm going to be president. That wore down over time very quickly. He felt like he understood better than a lot of people. And now, at this point, he's not outsourcing his agenda to anybody. He's not outsourcing his cabinet decisions to anybody else. It's his administration, and he's going to be driving these things. And I think you're going to end up seeing some pretty outside-of-the-box picks for his cabinet and a Senate who will be very happy to confirm just about anybody he chooses.
I am curious, though, with Don Jr.'s influence, do you see his influence different than you would see in Ivanka influence, for example?
Absolutely. Don Jr. obviously is much more in tune, I think, with that sort of that podcast crowd, as we're calling it, that Donald Trump ran. So that the young men, the online, the influencers, that's his world. Ivanka tried to play it down the middle as sort of the business, straight down the middle Republican style politics. He's got a very different view. He's going to see who excites people, who are true Donald Trump people, and reward them, and that can lead to some people outside of the box.
Outside of the box. Let's talk more about that, Eddie. Trump's placing a premium on choosing people who are really outside politics. What do you make of that? Would it work?
It all depends on how we measure will it work. Right? If the objective is to deconstruct the administrative state, you point people who have no idea how government works, it may work because it will gum it up in a lot of ways. I'm having a difficult time making this transition right? The irony of the first woman chief of staff for the Trump administration, given the post-Dobbs world. The irony of the emptiness of a certain kind of representational politics, the irony of someone like Don Jr. playing such an outsized role in determining who will actually administer policy, right, for the government. I guess he's uniquely qualified because he's Don Jr. I am really concerned that we're moving rather quickly because we have to, in some ways, to assessing what his administration will look like and not really settling down with the implications for this presidency, for American democracy as such. So it can work, but you got to understand what the measure is for working successfully.
We've all seen a Trump administration, been there,
Right.
done that. However, so much of what was discussed on the campaign trail is unprecedented if it were applied in this current administration or the new incoming administration. Peter, Trump has vowed to really reshape the whole federal government far beyond what he's done in his first term and beyond his White House chief of staff pick and the cabinet pick. He wants to purge federal employees, slash budgets. He wants to eliminate things like the Department of Education. Elon Musk even said this will bring temporary hardship for Americans. Do you expect him to follow through on this?
Well, not on everything, no. He said a lot of things over the years. Remember, in his first campaign, he said he would eliminate not just the deficit, but the entire national debt accumulated over the last couple hundred years. If he were in office for 8 years, instead, the debt went way, way up. So I would not expect him to do all of these things. I expect him to try a lot of these things. I think the immigration part of it is probably most important to him, his highest priority. It was really, if you listen to his campaign rallies, that was the central focus of his rhetoric. It really was almost a one-issue campaign at times. So I think you should expect him to do what he says he'll do on immigration, or at least to try. I think there'll be impediments. It won't be as easy as he thinks it will, particularly on the deportations. It's a very, even if you wanted to actually try to round up millions of people, it's just physically and resource-wise a very difficult thing to do. But I think you're right. I think that's what he's going to try to do. And I think he is talking about a transformation of the way government works. He wants to get rid of civil servants at the top level so that he can put in political loyalists. That's a really big thing. It'll end up in court, probably. He wants to reshape our alliances around the world. In effect, he basically is all but saying he doesn't believe in NATO as it was traditionally conceived. That's a very different way of thinking about America's role in the world. Tariffs, he wants to essentially use as a revenue-raising and protectionist mechanism in a way that hasn't been done in more than a century. Perhaps he has even floated the idea of getting rid of the income tax and replacing it with tariffs. Again, I don't think that happens. It's really a hard thing to do, even if you wanted to do it. But it's a radical idea. So he's coming in with not incremental changes, but big, big changes in mind, some of which he's going to really pursue.
One of those big changes, again, the mass deportation effort he's talked about. And in a phone interview with NBC News yesterday, he said that effort will have no price tag. There was one report, Brendan, I saw that put it at $88 billion a year to do something like this. Again, how practical is it? Unheard of. But how's he going to pay for it?
Yeah, that's the big question. I think we're going to test the limits of executive power, and that some of the things Donald Trump is going to do are probably not going to be limited by, Peter makes a good point, a lot of this will end up in court. One of the things I'm very curious about is how does he respond to court rulings that don't go in his favor, and does he follow them? I mean, that's the real constitutional crisis kind of thing that I'm looking at. Mass deportations on this scale we've never done. There are not the resources in place to do that. The friction is going to come when he goes and asks for it, when he goes to Congress and says, I need money, I need these things.
Republicans are supposed to be the party of fiscal conservatism, right?
There's no chance that the very narrow House majority is going to be able to pass spending bills that would accomplish what he's trying to do. There's going to be a lot of friction. There's going to be a House majority of 2 or 3 seats, and they're going to probably be unable to keep everybody together, and there's going to need to be Democrats coming in to help them do very basic things: fund the government, increase the debt limit. But these things that he's asking for are beyond the scale of anything that we've ever been able to see or do, and I can't imagine that he's going to be able to execute on it. So then what does he do when he doesn't have the resource? He doesn't have the legal authority to actually go and do things, but he is so motivated because he feels like he made this promise. He's not going to be undeterred. He's going to figure out some way to keep going after this.
Eddie, there's also the issue of state leaders and what can states do. And we have seen already the beginning of some blowback. Like we had Governor Gavin Newsom in California already come out calling a special session right now for ways to try to safeguard the state's policies around some of these more extreme ideas of Donald Trump. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker said this yesterday. Watch.
To anyone who intends to come take away the freedom and opportunity and dignity of Illinoisans, I would remind you that a happy warrior is still a warrior. You come for my people, you come through me.
How successful can governors be in all of this?
Well, I hope that they are. I mean, I think they have to understand. I mean, federalism is on the table in interesting sorts of ways. What's the role of the federal government? What's the role of the states? And in this moment, I think oftentimes what we do in moments like this, we fall back on our heels. We want to protect what we have. I think we should get on our toes and actually go on the offensive and fight for the world we want. And we have to do that at the level of the states. But we're going to understand, we have to understand it's going to be a battle.
What does that battle look like?
Well, it's going to be, you implement policies across the board, whether it's in terms of living wages, in terms of education, in terms of health care within your state. If you have that vision, right, if you have the support of your citizenry, try to pursue it. But I think it's important for us to understand. I live in an academic environment. I work at Princeton. And, a university or college can be committed to a diverse student population. And then Ed Blum will show up and sue them for trying to pursue their mission and vision. And so even as states pursue their ideas, even as governors pursue their vision, they need to understand there's a legal regime in place where I think there are going to be some folks who are going to respond almost immediately to the legality of what they try to do. So we're in for a battle.